Every so often, a war does not just decide who wins. It changes what war itself is. A single weapon appears, or an old one finally comes of age, and overnight, every general on Earth realizes that the rules they trained their whole lives on are gone. The cavalry charge becomes suicide. The battleship becomes a target. The million-dollar tank is hunted by something that costs 400. There have been 3 such moments in the last 100 years, and they line up almost perfectly with 3 wars. The First World War, the Second World War, and the war being fought in Ukraine right now. Each one introduced a new kind of weapon that did not just win battles. It rewrote the entire logic of the battlefield, and the ripple from each one is still shaping the world you live in today. So in this video, we are going to walk through all 3. We are going to look at what genuinely new weapon each war unleashed, why it changed everything, and how each one quietly set up the next. Because these 3 wars are not separate stories. They are one long chain reaction, and by the end you will see exactly where the chain is pointing next. Let's begin where the modern age of war began, in the mud. The First World War is remembered above all else for one image: 2 lines of trenches, a few hundred meters apart, and between them, a wasteland where a whole generation died to move the line a few kilometers. But to understand why the war looked like that, you have to understand the weapon that created it. And it was not the tank, or gas, or the airplane. It was the machine gun. When the war began in 1914, the generals of Europe still thought in terms of the previous century. War, to them, was maneuver, massed infantry advancing, cavalry charging, a decisive battle, a quick victory. They marched their men, shoulder to shoulder, into the fire of weapons none of them truly understood yet. A single modern machine gun could fire hundreds of rounds a minute, sweeping an entire field like a scythe. One gun crew could stop a battalion. The result was slaughter on a scale the world had never imagined. And both sides, unable to advance, did the only thing that kept men alive. They dug. That is how the trench was born, and with it, the defining agony of the First World War. The machine gun, combined with barbed wire and massed artillery, made defense so overwhelmingly stronger than attack that the front line barely moved for years. This was the first great lesson of industrial war. Technology had shifted the balance violently toward the defender, and there was no obvious way to shift it back. Men threw themselves at that wall of fire and died by the hundreds of thousands. At the Somme, at Verdun, at Passchendaele, entire armies were fed into ground that swallowed them. So both sides went looking, desperately, for something, anything, that could break the deadlock. And in that search, the First World War became a laboratory of horrors and wonders that gave birth to almost every weapon of the modern age. First came the attempt to poison the deadlock away. In 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres, the German army released clouds of chlorine gas across no man's land, the first large-scale use of chemical weapons in history. Later came phosgene, and then mustard gas, which burned and blinded and choked. Gas was a weapon of pure terror, and it killed and maimed horribly, but it never broke the stalemate. When the wind changed, it blew back on the men who released it. It was a horror without a decision. Then came the machine that would eventually change everything: the tank. If the problem was that men could not cross open ground against machine guns, the answer was obvious once you said it out loud. Send a machine that the bullets could not stop. The British built the first ones in secret, and on the 15th of September 1916, at the Somme, tanks rolled into battle for the very first time, and they mostly failed. Of the 49 sent, most broke down, got stuck in the mud, or were simply too slow. The tank's debut was a mechanical disaster, but the idea was right, and it only needed refining. A little over a year later, in November 1917, at the Battle of Cambrai, the British sent more than 400 tanks forward together, properly, with infantry and artillery and aircraft coordinated around them. And this time, in a matter of hours, they tore through the Hindenburg Line, the same fortified trenches that had cost oceans of blood to attack the old way. In a single morning, tanks advanced kilometers where men had spent years dying over meters. It was the first time the world saw the deadlock broken by a machine, and every serious soldier who heard about it understood. The future of war now had tracks and armor. And above the trenches, A third revolution was unfolding in the sky. When the war began, the airplane was a fragile novelty, used only to scout enemy positions. But within 4 years it had evolved with terrifying speed, into the fighter that shot other aircraft down, and the bomber that carried the war beyond the front line, and, for the first time, dropped death onto cities far behind it. The war ended with air forces that had not even existed when it began. But it would be a mistake to leave the First World War without naming its greatest killer, because it was not the machine gun, the gas, or the tank. It was artillery. More men died in that war from shell fire than from any other cause, torn apart by guns firing from kilometers away by men they never saw. The war became an industrial process of destruction, in which nations poured their entire economies into manufacturing shells by the hundreds of millions and hurling them at each other. At Verdun, the guns fired for the better part of a year. At the Somme, tens of thousands of British soldiers fell on a single morning. This was something genuinely new in human history. War not as a clash of armies, but as the industrialized grinding down of whole societies, measured in factory output and the endurance of nations. And it reached beneath the sea as well. German submarines, U-boats, waged a new kind of war on shipping, sinking supply vessels without warning, and nearly starving Britain out of the war. It was that campaign and the sinking of civilian ships that helped drag the United States into the conflict and decide it. The submarine had quietly announced that in modern war, no one, not even a merchant far from any front, was safe. So look at what the First World War actually did. It took the old world of cavalry and glory and buried it in mud, and in trying to escape the trap the machine gun had built, it invented, or nearly invented, the tank, chemical weapons, military aviation, and modern artillery all at once. It ended in 1918, with more than 16 million dead and a shattered continent. But it did something else too. It handed the next generation of generals a box of brand new machines and a single unanswered question: how do you use them to win, instead of just to survive? The answer to that question would become the Second World War. Because the great irony of the First World War is that it invented the tools of mobile war and then failed to use them. The tank existed, the airplane existed, the radio existed, but they arrived too late and too slowly to be woven together. It fell to the next war to take that same box of machines and combine them into something the world had never seen. And when it did, the result was not stalemate. It was the fastest, most sweeping, most destructive conquests in human history. The Second World War is the story of what happens when the weapons of the First World War finally grow up. The tank that crawled and broke down at the Somme became, 20 years later, the spearhead of a doctrine the Germans called blitzkrieg, lightning war. The idea was simple and devastating. Instead of scattering tanks among the infantry, concentrate them into massed armored fists, support them with aircraft acting as flying artillery, coordinate everything by radio, and punch straight through the enemy line before he can react. The very same trench deadlock that had defined the First World War was rendered obsolete almost overnight. In 1940, using these methods, Germany conquered France, the country that had held out for 4 years in the previous war, in about 6 weeks. But the Second World War did not stop at perfecting the tank. It unleashed a wave of genuinely new technologies, and several of them permanently changed the shape of war and of the world. The first was invisible, and it may have saved Britain. It was radar. For the first time, a nation could see an air attack coming while it was still far away, detect the enemy bombers over the sea, count them, and send fighters to exactly the right place to meet them. In 1940, in the Battle of Britain, a heavily outnumbered Royal Air Force used radar to hold off the German Air Force and prevent an invasion. It was the first time in history that the decisive advantage in a battle was not a bigger gun or thicker armor, but information, knowing where the enemy was before he arrived. Every modern military built on sensors and early warning traces its lineage back to that summer. And there was a second invisible revolution, quieter even than radar, that would outlast the war by a century. It was the secret battle over information itself, the war of codes. Both sides encrypted their orders, and both sides fought a hidden campaign to break the other's ciphers. At a country estate in Britain called Bletchley Park, a team of mathematicians, among them Alan Turing, cracked the German Enigma machine, letting the Allies read enemy orders as they were sent. To do it faster, they built some of the first programmable electronic computing machines the world had ever seen. So the Second World War did not only give us the missile and the bomb. In the effort to break enemy codes, it gave birth to the computer, the machine that would, in time, come to run every weapon, every network, and every drone in the war we will reach at the end of this story. The information age was born in a wartime hut, trying to read the enemy's mail. The next revolution happened at sea, and it dethroned a king. For centuries, naval power had meant the battleship, the biggest guns, the thickest steel, the pride of every fleet. The Second World War killed it. In a series of shattering lessons, the crippling of battleships from the air, and above all the great carrier battles of the Pacific like Midway, the world learned that a ship carrying aircraft could destroy an enemy fleet from over the horizon, without the two sides ever seeing each other. The aircraft carrier, launching planes that struck from beyond the reach of any gun, made the mighty battleship a relic almost overnight. Naval power was no longer about the size of your guns. It was about the reach of your aircraft. And in the sky, war crossed into the future. Germany fielded the first jet fighter, the Messerschmitt 262, faster than anything the Allies could put against it. And Germany also launched the V2, the first long-range guided ballistic missile in history. The V2 was a terror weapon that fell on London faster than the speed of sound, striking before its own scream of arrival could be heard. Militarily, neither the jet nor the missile came in time to change the war's outcome. But historically, they were seeds of enormous power. The jet engine would define aviation for the rest of the century, and the V2, built by a team led by Wernher von Braun, was the direct ancestor of both the intercontinental ballistic missile and the rocket that would one day carry human beings to the moon. And there was one more way the Second World War changed the meaning of war, and it fell from the sky onto cities. Both sides embraced strategic bombing, the deliberate destruction of the enemy's cities and industry from the air, on a scale the lone bombers of the First World War could only hint at. Thousand-plane raids reduced whole cities to ash. The firebombing of places like Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo killed civilians in numbers that rivaled entire battles. The logic was chilling and new, that you could win a war not by defeating the enemy's army in the field, but by breaking his society behind it. Total war had arrived, a war in which the factory worker and the city were targets as surely as the soldier. And it was this idea, war aimed at the whole of a nation, that set the stage for the single weapon that would take it to its ultimate and final conclusion. Because at the very end came the weapon that changed not just war, but the entire human condition. In August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a single flash, a single aircraft carrying a single bomb could now do what once required a 1,000-plane raid. Japan surrendered, and the Second World War ended. But the world that emerged was permanently, fundamentally different. For the first time, humanity possessed a weapon that could end humanity. The entire Cold War, the arms race, the balance of terror that has shaped the last 80 years, all of it flows from that August. The atomic bomb did not just win a war. It froze the great powers into a standoff so dangerous that they have never dared to fight each other directly since. So the Second World War took the raw inventions of the first and forged them into the modern world. Mechanized armies, air power, radar, the missile, the jet, and the bomb that ended total war between great powers. It killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, and it left behind a paradox that would define the rest of the century. The most powerful weapons ever built, nuclear weapons, had become too terrible to use. And that paradox created a strange new kind of war. If the superpowers could never fight each other directly, then the future of conflict would belong to smaller, cheaper, cleverer weapons, fought out in the places where the giants would not risk the bomb. Which brings us, at last, to the war being fought right now. The war in Ukraine is the third great rupture, and we are living inside it, which makes it the hardest one to see clearly. But its central lesson is already unmistakable, and in a strange way, it is the mirror image of the First World War. Where the machine gun once made war enormously expensive for the attacker and handed all the power to the defender, the weapon defining this war has done something almost opposite. It has made precision, devastatingly cheap, and handed lethal power to almost anyone. That weapon is the drone. And to understand why it changes everything, you have to think about cost. For the last 80 years, military power meant expensive, exquisite machines. The tank, the jet, the warship, each costing millions or tens of millions, each operated by a wealthy state. The Ukraine war shattered that assumption. A first-person view drone, an FPV, can be built from commercial parts for a few $100s, flown by one soldier, and steered directly into a tank worth several million. Suddenly, the most protected, most expensive machines on the battlefield could be hunted and killed by something that costs about as much as a bicycle. The entire economics of war, the assumption that firepower and precision belong to the rich and powerful, cracked open. And just as the First World War was a laboratory of new machines, so is this one. Except now, the cycle of invention runs not in years, but in weeks. When Russia learned to jam the radio link of the FPV drone, Ukraine answered with the fiber optic drone, trailing a hair-thin cable that cannot be jammed at all. When the front line became too deadly to cross, they built ground robots to carry supplies, evacuate the wounded, and even take the first shot, so that a machine, and not a person, walks into the kill zone. They sent unmanned boats across the Black Sea, and with them, drove a battle fleet away from its own coast, a navy defeated, in part, by vessels with no one aboard. They carried robots into battle by air and by sea, and now they are turning the first laser weapons on the drones overhead. This war is compressing a century of the earlier war's invention into a handful of years, live, on camera, for the whole world to study. And behind all of those machines sits the quiet inheritance of that wartime hut at Bletchley, the computer and the network. This is the first war in history fought over a web of satellites and software. Troops share a target seen by one drone with an artillery gun kilometers away, in seconds, over commercial satellite internet beamed from orbit. A pilot behind the lines watches a live video feed and guides a loitering munition, a drone that circles for hours, waiting, before diving onto a target it has patiently hunted. Cheap sensors, cheap processors, and cheap radios have been woven into a kind of nervous system stretched across the whole battlefield, so that seeing and striking, which used to be separate and slow, have collapsed into a single instant. The computer that was born to read the enemy's codes now flies the machines, finds the targets, and closes the loop. But the deepest change is not any single machine. It is the same kind of shift we saw in the First and Second World Wars, a violent swing in the balance between attacker and defender, and between the expensive and the cheap. In 1914, technology handed overwhelming advantage to the defender, and the result was stalemate. In 1940, it swung back to the attacker, and the result was blitzkrieg. Today, the cheap, mass-produced, precise drone is swinging it again, this time not between attacker and defender, but between the few and the many. Precision used to be the privilege of superpowers. Now it can be bought by the crate, and the same logic that let Ukraine turn $100 machines against a giant is spreading, inevitably, to every army, every militia, and every actor on Earth. Which is exactly why these three wars are one story. Step back and look at the pattern. In each war, a new weapon appeared that made the previous era's most powerful thing suddenly vulnerable. The machine gun made the massed infantry charge suicidal. The tank and the airplane made the trench obsolete. The aircraft carrier made the battleship a relic. The atomic bomb made total war between great powers unthinkable. And now the cheap drone is making the multi-million-dollar platform, the tank, the warship, the manned aircraft, terrifyingly easy to kill. Every single time, the giant of one era was brought low by the innovation of the next. And every single time, the world that came after was permanently, irreversibly changed. There is one more thread that ties all three together, and it is the most important one of all. In every case, the decisive edge did not go to the side with the most tradition, or the most glory, or even, in the end, the most money. It went to the side that adapted fastest, that looked at the new machine clearly, understood what it meant, and reorganized itself around it before the enemy could. Britain that embraced radar. The commanders who saw that the carrier had replaced the battleship. Ukraine turning a consumer drone into a weapon of war in a matter of weeks. War, in the end, does not reward the strong. It rewards the fast. And that is the thought to carry out of all this. Because the chain reaction is not finished. We are standing inside the third rupture right now, watching the cheap machine and the thinking machine rewrite the rules in real time, exactly as the machine gun and the tank and the bomb did before them. The only real question, the one every military on Earth is scrambling to answer, is the same question the generals of 1914 failed to answer in time. The rules have changed. The old giants are vulnerable. Who will see it first and adapt fastest? Thanks for watching. If you want to understand the weapons quietly rewriting how this war and the next one will be fought, stay with us, because the future of war is being built right now, one new machine at a time.